Geeks and geekettes, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, comic book fans the world over, it's time once again for Ask Chuck Dixon, your opportunity to ask me, a world famous, world renowned, world esteemed, prestigious writer of comic books. You can ask me any question you like, and I'll tell you all about what it is I do for a living. And what I do for a living is I write those damn comic books. So, hey, if you haven't subscribed, please do so. You know the drill. Hit the button below. If you have subscribed, thank you very much. If you're feeling particularly ambitious, you can head over to Subscribestar. Put in my name, Chuck Dixon, and help me out. It helps fund this channel directly, as well as pay the artists on many of my special independent projects, like My Sister Suprema and Something Big. Okay. Andy Openshaw asks, I have a question for your Ask Chuck slot. If you got asked, would you write a Mac Bolan Executioner comic or perhaps a team up with the Punisher? I've never been a big fan of Executioner. I read some of them, and they're fun, but they're not as dark and noirish as I would prefer. It's certainly not as dark and brutal as Frank Castle, and I like my vigilantes dark and brutal. There's something a little too, I don't know, clean cut about the Executioner. There's something, I don't know. It doesn't grab me. A series I prefer is The Destroyer, because there's a sense of humor. It's kind of a hip sense of humor. And Remo Williams' moral compass is set at about the same place Frank Castle's is. He doesn't care who gets in the way, who he has to hurt in order to accomplish his goals. And now, as far as teaming up two vigilante characters, Mike Baron and I have actually worked on something like that, which I guess Mike, I'm going to leave it to Mike, since he was the driving force on the project. I'm going to leave it to him to announce it, but I'm just going to tease it here that Mike and I have written a team up project of our own. So there you go. Ian Potash, I want to comment on something you don't seem to get enough credit for: writing interesting henchmen. Part of Bane's strength in Nightfall comes from his supporting cast: Bird, Zombie, and Trog. It's a great bit of continuity that they stuck around long enough to feel like fully realized characters with unique personalities. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Great henchmen goons can elevate any villain. RoboCop, Commando, even Batman 89 had great goon lineups. What are some of your favorite henchmen in books or movies? For me, Die Hard represented it represents something to me, in that you had the main villain, Hans Gruber, but then he had his army of henchmen, his small army of henchmen, and each one was drawn in enough so we would recognize them later. So when Bruce Willis is mowing them down with machine guns and blowing them up in balls of fire, we know who's dying. We've built up an enmity for the people that he's killing. We've gotten to know them, and this, to me, that's the perfect way to present a gang of henchmen. They have to be unique and have some kind of personality, something distinctive about each one of them, so it matters when they're knocked off as the hero goes through his paces. Now, as far as favorite henchmen, Baldric from Blackadder has to be one. He's loyal, he's steadfast, he's not terribly bright, and he's willing to take a lot of punishment. And he's one of my favorite characters in any kind of fiction. The Wild Bunch had two great henchmen. You had General Mapache, who was the main villain of the piece, and the Wild Bunch go to sell him guns. But Mapache, for the most part, is a clown. He's either drunk or just full of himself or showing off. He's just a real ass. The dangerous one is Jorge Rusek playing Zamora. And Zamora doesn't get a lot of scenes in the movie. He doesn't get a lot of lines. But each one of them really heightens the suspense, because you get the sense that as oblivious as Mapache is to what's going on around him, Zamora, he's always watching. He's always thinking. He's like a hawk. He's always there. And you can tell that he takes everything said to him with a degree of skepticism, that he's always working at an angle. And every time he's in a scene, it just seems like everything ratchets up. That's good writing, for one thing, and that's really good acting, is to, just without saying a word, be that menacing. And that's a great henchman. Another great henchman in the Wild Bunch is Herrera, played by the great Alfonso Arroyo. Generally a comic actor, and in the Wild Bunch, he is comic relief to some degree. But there's also this menace beneath it. He breaks the persona of wanting to be cooperative, wanting to be their friend, all the rest of it. He sort of breaks through that to make some, implied threats on the lives of William Holden, Ernest Borgnine, and their buddies. And it's done very deftly, and done with as a different kind of menace than the Zamora character presents. Another movie with some great henchmen, real life henchmen, is Tombstone. Not only do you have Ike Clanton, but you've got, Johnny Ringo, played to perfection by Michael Biehn, and Curly Bill Brocious, played to even more perfection by Powers Booth. So once again, it's like the Die Hard principle. Tombstone presents us with a whole bunch of distinctive bad guys, so that when the showdown comes and the bullets are flying and the bad guys are dropping like flies, we relate to it in some way, relate some evil or nastiness they had done in the past, so we know that they damn well deserved it. So, and then one of my favorite henchmen of all time is Rupert of Hentzau, played by Douglas Fairbanks Jr. in The Prisoner of Zenda. He is the henchman. He is the creepy, suave, womanizing apparatchik of Black Michael, played by Raymond Massey. Black Michael seeks the throne that Ronald Colman sits uneasily upon in The Prisoner of Zenda, but Rupert of Hentzau is his cat's paw, expert swordsman and everything else. One of the best sword fights ever put on film is in Prisoner of Zenda, and Douglas Fairbanks Jr.'s departure in that scene is unforgettable. So terrific henchman. I'll probably think of more after this, but those are the ones that came to the top of mind immediately. David Jordan, I was listening to your latest appearance on Signal of Doom podcast, and you mentioned that you've always hated the coloring on Law Dog comic. What is it about the coloring that you hate? It was too garish. It really didn't bring anything to Flint's drawings. Now, I sympathize with anybody who has to either ink or color Flint Henry, because he throws so much detail on a page that it's sometimes impossible to tell what's going on where. And of course, it's the job of the colorist to bring out those things, to drop back the background and bring out the foreground elements and choose points of light, although Flint's very good at choosing points of light. But I just don't think the coloring matched Flint. There was no subtlety to it at all. And Flint's artwork, to me, needs subtlety in the coloring, because there's no subtlety in the black and white line art. So you really need coloring to sort of step back and not draw attention to itself the way it did here. Currently, I'm having Law Dog redone, recolored, remastered, and this is all from the original art. So you'll be seeing that soon, digitally at least anyway, at first, and possibly in print down the road. Depends on how things go. But thanks for bringing up Law Dog, one of my favorite series I've ever worked on. Josh Reed just started reading the comic book of The Eye of the World, and I'm enjoying it quite a bit. How did you swing the chance to adapt it, and do you have any fun stories about writing it? I don't have a lot of fun stories, and how I got it was I was working at CrossGen. I was under an exclusive. I could only work for CrossGen. And as CrossGen's fortunes began to fade, as it was apparent that we were heading toward bankruptcy, we were released from our exclusive contract so that we could seek work elsewhere. And when CrossGen announced this, they basically announced that, hey, there's a whole bunch of freelancers in the wild now. And publishers showed up in person in some cases to hire as many of our artists away as possible. And the Dable brothers, who had gotten the license to do Robert Jordan's fantasy novels as comics, approached me and asked if I was interested. And at that point in time, with CrossGen folding, I knew pretty soon I wasn't going to have any work. So I said, yes, I will. And I think I got it on the strength of the Hobbit adaptation I had done. I had adapted J.R.R. Tolkien's Hobbit, and it was a worldwide bestseller. Again, largely because of the release of the Lord of the Rings movies. So my name was kind of at the top of the list for guys to adapt fantasy work. And I got it. Did I have any fun? No. I didn't have any fun. As I've said in previous videos, Robert Jordan's work was very difficult, very challenging to adapt to comics because it simply didn't lend itself to comics. So I had to do a lot of finagling to get it to work as a comic book. Now, I could have just phoned it in and did a direct adaptation and just had characters talking, or walking through the woods for page after page after page after page before something happened, and then have everything happen in the final issue, the way the novels are set up. It just doesn't work in comics. It works in prose. Obviously, Robert Jordan is a best-selling. These things are best-selling. They're huge. They're huge-selling books worldwide. And that works in prose. It doesn't work in comics. And that was my job, and I did it as well as I could. But I can't say any of it was fun. Parappa the Rappa. Or is that Parappa the Rappa? Massive fan of Nightwing and your run on the character. I wanted to know, seeing as a core struggle for the Nightwing was earning equal respect as Batman, and given the nature of superhero comics and combat, was there ever any intent of a particular moment within your run crafted to show Grayson's parody to his mentor as far as martial arts prowess? Thank you for your consideration. Well, given that our only guidelines for Scott McDaniel and I going into Nightwing, our only guidelines given to us by Scott Peterson was that we create a new town for Nightwing to inhabit, and that town be named Bloodhaven. Name was picked for us. And also that every issue be a Jackie Chan movie. And so Nightwing's martial arts prowess was on display from the very outset. The very first time we see him, he's in the middle of a empty hand fight. And pretty much went from there. And I think we showed that Nightwing was in almost every way Batman's equal in fighting skills. But of course, Batman is Batman. He's top of the bill. So he gets the top slot in the Bat family as a fighter. But Nightwing ain't no slouch. And I showed in many, many occasions, not only in Nightwing's own comic, but in his different appearances throughout the Bat titles, that this guy could kick ass with the best of them. So I point you to that helicopter chase that in one of the earlier issues of Nightwing that Scott McDaniel did, so you can see Nightwing's full athletic and martial arts abilities on display. My Milos Militek, I hope I got that right. Batman Vengeance of Bane #1 cover is printed without the CCA stamp, but issue 2 had Comics Code Authority stamp. Brilliant Glenn Fabre covers on both, by the way. Do you have any insight why that was? Did CCA have an issue with a particular scene or the comic in general, considering it's set in a brutal prison? I read it as a pretty dark origin story for Bane. You know, in all these years, no one has ever pointed out to me that the Comics Code did not appear on that cover. And many times as I've looked at that cover, and I've looked at that cover many, many times, mostly to sign them, I never noticed it didn't have that. And no one ever discussed with me why. Although if you read the story, it's pretty obvious why. I mean, yeah, some pretty awful things happen. And it's pretty strongly implied in one of those scenes that, juvenile Bane is rescued from a pretty hideous fate at the hands of one of the other convicts. And then later rescues himself. I mean, he does stab a guy to death with the head of a teddy bear. So I can see why the comics code wasn't real hip on that. And we did show real blood, which comics code at the time, they weren't big fans of showing red blood and exit wounds, things like that. They had their rules. I never thought about any of the comics code rules when I was writing Vengeance of Bane 1. I just thought, hey, I'm going to push the envelope, and if it goes, it goes. If it doesn't, we'll pull back a little bit. But I never heard word one from my editors about pulling back a little bit. So I guess they just thought, hey, take it or leave it. If it has to go out without the code, it'll have to go out without the code. And that's the way it went. And that's the history of Bane. He's a rebel. He doesn't follow no rules. He makes his own rules. He has his own comics code. Gentle Savage. Were there any ideas for DC Elseworlds story that you pitched to DC that got rejected? Yeah, there were a few. I wanted to do more Pirate Batman. I did Detective Annual number 7, Pirate Batman. I did another 10-page story with Kiki Alcatena in Batman Chronicles. And I wanted to do at least one more in order to bring us up to trade paperback length so we could do a trade paperback Pirate Batman collection, a Captain Leatherwing collection. But we never got there. And I pitched the story in which the wicked Felina, Catwoman in this universe, and Captain Leatherwing decide to make their arrangements legal. And to do this, they had to return to England because, as it turns out, Captain Leatherwing is actually a nobleman back in England. And so they return, but their wedding plans are kind of messed up by a Poison Ivy character who lives in this huge mansion. It's all arboretum. It's a huge greenhouse, and also Lord Conundrum, who is the Riddler in this incarnation. And Lord Conundrum is not a real lord. He is a highwayman who tells riddles. And I had this great big book of Irish riddles I wanted to use, old Irish riddles, and never got to use them. A second pitch I made for a pirate thing was to have basically retell the origin of Bane even closer to the origins of Man in the Iron Mask, which we used to base a lot of the stuff on that inspired Graham and I to do the character, and make Bane basically a weapon, a cat's paw for the Spanish Inquisition. But I got nixed on both of them, which is a shame because I think a Pirate Batman trade in print today would still do well. It could be very, very popular. Another one I planned sequels for was I did the Elseworlds thing, the Justice Riders, Justice League set in the Old West, and I wanted to do 2 more volumes, one featuring Kid Flash and the Flash and Jay Garrick, and had a whole storyline about who was the fastest in the West. Went nowhere with that one. And I also proposed a Justice Riders with Batman and Robin, and Batman and Robin lead. Actually, at the beginning of the story, Batman dies. He's gunned down by Bane. And then Robin wants to pursue Bane into Mexico on the Vengeance Trail, and the Justice Riders join him. But that one went nowhere either. What might have been, and also is always my Dirty Harry Batman crossover, which I still regret to this day I never got to do. Twin Spin. Gentle Savage asks once again, what was the inspiration for the Dionysus character in Bane Conquest and the inspiration for King Snake? Yeah, we needed a villain, a foil worthy of Bane, and since Bane and Batman had already been at odds physically, we didn't want to have another like grudge match. We didn't want to, some big bestial guy. It seemed redundant. I mean, it's like that issue's been settled. Batman's tougher than Bane in the end. And we all know Bane's tough, but does he have to prove it again? No. And so we introduced kind of the antithesis of Bane, which was Dionysus, who was this sort of mutated, sad creature of high intellect. And Dionysus engages in a battle of wits with Bane that he loses. And the reason for that is the reason for his existence is to serve as basically a informant for Bane and an uneasy ally. Dionysus does anything he can to survive, and he'll betray anybody. He'll do anything. He's a complete weasel. And I really like that. And I like the fact that he was a high intellect, but Bane always thwarted him. Dionysus, as smart as he was, as intelligent as he was, as literally connected to digital and digital media, as connected as he was to world databases and everything else, he still wasn't able to get around Bane. Bane was always a step ahead of him. I thought it was a neat relationship because he starts out as a adversary and then ends up as basically an asset, but an asset that Bane never lets very far from his sight. And of course, Dionysus, the name came from the tyrant of Syracuse. At the beginning of the story, if you remember, he had an operative named Damocles. And the story of Dionysus and Damocles and the sword of Damocles is something you can look up on Google. It's maybe it's a legend, maybe it really happened, but it's a moral tale about the weight of responsibility, the weight of rulership. As far as how I came up with King Snake, I needed a badass martial arts guy, and I didn't want to go with the usual Asian stereotype. So I went with this dude who was an English guy who made a fortune in Hong Kong and was sort of an Orientalist, an Anglo fascinated with all the things about Asia. And I just thought, this effete elitist dude who was could kick your ass too. What's more infuriating than that? A snobby guy who can back up his snobbery. And boy, he couldn't wait to see Robin put him down. All right, next one. Ryan Howard. I know you generally dislike magic and supernatural elements in stories, but what are your thoughts on elemental westerns like Pale Rider or High Plains Drifter, where it's heavily implied the protagonist is a spirit of vengeance returned from the dead? What are some of your favorite elemental westerns? I really don't have any favorite elemental westerns. High Plains Drifter, yes, it is certainly presented that the Clint Eastwood character wanders in off the desert, although it's left open to speculation that perhaps he is the twin brother of the man who was killed in the town. The question remains, why don't the residents of the town recognize him? Because he looks exactly like the guy that they saw whipped to death. And when they did nothing. I think this was more Eastwood's take on High Noon, sort of twisted, dark take on High Noon. It can be implied because he wanders out of the heat haze of the desert and wanders back into it at the end, that maybe he was a phantom, maybe he was never there. But I think that's just presentation. I really do think he's the twin brother of the sheriff who died that fateful night. Pale Rider is more problematic for me. Yeah, it has some sort of mystical, weird elements to it. But what bothers me more about Pale Rider is that so much of it is lifted from Shane. The basic plot structure and even some of the events in the story are right out of Shane. I really don't know why Clint Eastwood did that. Why he couldn't have, as he did later on, by a much better Western screenplay, Unforgiven. And as much as I love a Clint Eastwood Western, I kind of wish he didn't waste his time with this one. It's just not that good. It's kind of all over the place. Twin spin. Ba-boom. Ryan Howard again. What overlooked or obscure war, conflict, or theater of war would you most like to write a war comic about? Well, there's a whole bunch of them. One of them would be Harald Hardrade, who was the self-proclaimed king of Norway. But as a younger man, he sailed into Russia and eventually ended up down in the Byzantine Empire, where he hired on as what were called Varangians. And these were hired mercenaries who worked for the Empress Zoe. And Hardrade worked in the service of the Empress for a long time, leading a successful band of Vikings, under her flag, under her banner, and conquered, a brilliant campaign to conquer Sicily, a number of other things, and then he escaped. Emperor Zoe felt that he was indentured for life. He didn't feel that way. He was getting out, and he and his band escaped by sailing their boats down the Bosporus and sailing their boats over the massive chains that blocked shipping there through a series of ingenious tricks that Hardrade was good. Hardrade was a really good strategist, really clever at workarounds, and also a tough guy. He ended his life at Stamford Bridge. The Battle of Stamford Bridge, which was fought just a few days before the Battle of Hastings, the battle in which the Normans took Saxon Britain away from the Saxons. And I really like to do some early stories of Harald Hardrade. Another era I really like is the French Foreign Legion in Mexico under Maximilian. And wow. The French Foreign Legion fighting here in North America with, Yaqui Indians and Apaches and all kinds of crazy stuff going on. Juaristas, bandits and regular Mexican army. It's just a big, colorful display. In France, they did a great comic series called Sauvage, set in this period. And it just made me want to write this kind of stuff even more. I did touch on it a little bit back in Savage Tales when Ron Wagner and I did an 8-pager about the Battle of Cameroon, one of the most famous battles in French Foreign Legion history, fought in Mexico against Juaristas. Okay. Mexico again, another great military campaign I'd love to write some comics about, and I have some ideas for a comic about, was Pershing's expedition to Mexico to pursue Pancho Villa. And some awesome stuff happened during that. And it's one of those chapters of history that kind of got overshadowed by World War I, which, happened a few months later. And it's kind of like left in the mists of the past. Another period I'd love to revisit, the Taiping Rebellion, the bloodiest war ever fought on this planet up until World War I. It was a massive revolution fought against Imperial China, against the emperor, by a group of religious fanatics who believed they were led by the brother of Christ. Christ's little brother was leading them. That's what they believed. Massive cult, and tens of millions of people died in an incredibly destructive war that went on for quite a while, with Western powers involved on the fringes, picking up the pieces, grabbing up the spoils. I touched on it in Sons of Heaven, my 5th Bad Times book, but I'd love to revisit the period. And of course, I've always had my toy soldier fascination, literal toy soldier fascination, with the Zulu War. And we've all heard the story of Rorke's Drift. A lot of us have heard the story of the massacre at Isla Wanda. But I'd love to tell the story of the rest of the Zulu War and what the British and the Boers did in order to defeat the largest land army on the continent of Africa. The Zulus are absolutely fascinating in that they used European military tactics, basically created themselves. They didn't copy them or anything else. Shaka Zulu worked out how he could use the peculiar landscape of the Transvaal and South Africa and literally built an army piece by piece. The Zulus are like the Comanches of Texas. They are not a people. They are a collection of people. And Shaka Zulu would conquer one tribe after another, and assimilate them and bring them into his tribe. And he was able to launch, armies in regiments and units with strategies and tactics and drills and everything else, the same way a European army would be fielded. And in the same numbers. I mean, tens of thousands of warriors out ready to fight. And what the steps that the British had to take in order to defeat him is a story that doesn't get told very often. And then Secheweo, the king of the Zulus at the time, it's a fascinating story about his life after the war. He was very, very popular. He visited England. He was the toast of the town for a long time. It's just a very peculiar period, and one that doesn't get talked about a lot. Another one, I'd love to do anything about the Mongol Empire, any of the Mongol Khans, invasion of Russia, the invasion of Hungary and Poland, the siege of Samarkand. Just one incredible story after another. So that's it for your regular questions this week. But every once in a while, I get questions sort of, over the transom, if anybody remembers what a transom is. And a lot of these come from friends. And a lot of these are questions I get over and over and over again. Because often they can't believe my answer. So I'm going to handle one of them this week. I'm warning you right now, I'm possibly going to step on some of your beloved childhood creations right now. I'm going to break your toys. But the question I get from friends all the time, usually my boomer friends around my same age, is, why don't you like Jonny Quest? Now, Jonny Quest, to a lot of my friends and a lot of people that read me, think Jonny Quest is a perfect fit for Chuck Dixon. It's got adventure. It's got, this, that, the other thing. It's got all the elements. It's like Airboy. No, it's not. But why don't you like it? And then the other thing from my friends is, well, you're the same age I am, and I love Jonny Quest. Why didn't you love Jonny? Didn't you see Jonny Quest? Was it not on your television? Did you have to go to bed before Jonny Quest came on? No. I got to see Jonny Quest. I saw Jonny Quest from its very first episode, and I watched 3 or 4 of them, and I never watched it again. And I didn't like it. And yeah, it has all the elements that a Chuck Dixon story should have. Good guys and bad guys, and mysteries to solve, and adventure, and blah, blah, blah. High adventure, bold stuff. And yeah, I know Alex Toth worked on it. And yeah, in books, I have every single model sheet available. And I look at them and I admire them. And it's a well-designed show. I really like the way it looks for the most part. I know Doug Wildey worked on it, another enormous talent. And I appreciate all of that. But it all comes off kind of saccharine to me, kind of empty. There's no hormones. And I understand in a kid's cartoon, maybe they felt you couldn't have any hormones, if you know what I mean. But it just sort of comes off as pandering kid stuff. I never bought it. I mean, the comic strips in the newspaper running at the time seemed to have more gusto. And then we come to the monsters. And I already hear what all of you are arguing, okay? I was turned off when the monsters weren't real. Now, I hear over and over again, yeah, well, in later episodes they were. You got to see the Invisible Monster. It was great. And this one and that one, they were real in later ones. But they weren't real in the opening ones. And where they lost me, where they utterly lost me, was the Loop Garou episode. They promised a werewolf. And werewolves are my thing. I love werewolves. Werewolves are my favorite monster. And they present a werewolf, and it's like, hey, this is cool. It's a werewolf story. Johnny and Haji and Race and Dr. Quest are going to meet a werewolf. Bandit going to meet a werewolf. And it turns out to be a guy in a suit. And as a kid, I'm like, it's a cartoon. It doesn't have to be a guy in a suit. Why does it have to be a guy in a suit? What, are they afraid us little kids are going to be too scared? I mean, I stay up for Double Chiller Theater. I can handle a cartoon werewolf. Give me a freaking break. And that was it. That was the end for me of Jonny Quest. I never watched another episode. Now the next episodes, they may be genius. I'll never know. I just lost all interest. And generally, I have a thing. This is where it's going to hurt. It's going to hurt more. I'm going to hurt you more if you love this stuff. I just have an animus toward Hanna-Barbera entirely. I liked Hanna-Barbera when I was a kid, a little tiny kid. And when I was about 6, I began to see through it. See, like, this is repetitive. This is dumb. They use the same gag on Flintstones every week. These cartoons are like, there's nothing engaging here. Even the voices are starting to annoy me, which is something that would never happen with Bugs Bunny. It's like I feel like I'm being insulted. There's no challenging material here. There's no hormones. This doesn't seem real. And this is because of who Hanna-Barbera were. They were certainly talented. They were talented animators and everything else. But I really got the impression they were just in it for the cash. And if you look at this picture, you kind of see it. I don't know which one's Joe and which one's Bill. But the guy on the left looks like, you stupid kids. We got your money. And the other guy just looks happy thinking about his bank account. They don't look like, Walt Disney, when he would hold up a Mickey Mouse doll, looked like he was in heaven. And he probably was. These guys just look like, yeah. And after this, we're going to, fly off in our Learjet. That's just my impression of Hanna-Barbera, and it's kind of borne out by their history. They started at MGM doing Tom and Jerry cartoons. They did Tom and Jerry cartoons for years. They won Academy Awards for doing Tom and Jerry cartoons. And this is against stiff competition from Disney. And they deserve them because, even though they were silly cat chasing a mouse cartoons, they were inventive. They were well produced. I mean, just beautifully produced, beautifully animated, backgrounds all well done, just seamless, fun entertainment. Music was great, blah, blah, blah. Just these were good, solid Hollywood cartoons, great stuff. Then we move into the 50s and, budgets are tighter, not as many people going to the movies, and they start doing the limited animation thing. They start making the animation look cheap. But instead of thinking of a new way of doing it, like the UPA animators did, to make it more clever, to basically turn that lower budget into something charming or elegant or streamlined, they just made it look cheaper. They just made it look crappier and obvious. I mean, when you were a kid, you could tell limited animation. It's like, oh, his arm just changed color. His arm's going to move, but the rest of him isn't. When you were a kid, you could spot that stuff and you knew limited animation and you didn't like it, but it was everywhere by the time I was, like in kindergarten. It was all over TV. It was all limited animation. And it was tired stuff. It just wasn't clever. Everybody phoned it in. I think even worse. I'll get into that in a minute. And it never, at Hanna-Barbera, it never really got any better. It's like they didn't want anything better for themselves. So they just end up creating, one note, cardboard, lifeless, flaccid characters, just doing the same jokes and the same gags and the same voices over and over and over and over again. It's like, they thought, the stupid kids, they don't know. And the stupid TV stations buying the stuff, they don't know. They don't know that, what do they care? And it's remarkable to me, and I just found out, why this was, is for me, the only creation Hanna-Barbera ever did that came to life for me was the Jetsons. And the Jetsons was in it for most of its run, it only ran one season, was smart. It was inventive. It had something to say about the world to come, which in a lot of cases is still accurate. People leading sedentary lives, people relying too much on gadgets. I mean, it's more so true today than it was in the early 60s when the Jetsons premiered. And there's also a dark element an undertone to the Jetsons. There's mentions of curfews, and when you see the police arrive in a Jetsons cartoon, they're a bit on the Judge Dredd side. They're very authoritative. They're not funny. So it's almost like the creators of the show were trying to throw in an Orwellian aspect to the world of the Jetsons, very subtly, very much in the background. And what I learned recently is the Jetsons was the very first color television show to appear on the ABC network. And to the network, it was to be a big deal. It was going to run counter to the Walt Disney, Wonderful Walt Disney on NBC. And ABC was going to see if they could give Walt Disney a run for his money with this brand new show. And because of that, because Hanna-Barbera were so busy with the Flintstones and with this and with that, they handed the production of this largely over to a team within the organization, and they ran with it. And my own particular theory is that George O'Hanlon, who did the voice of George Jetson and did an awesome job as George Jetson, they took his character directly from a character that O'Hanlon had played in a series of movie shorts. It was a character called Joe McDokes, and he was just an everyday average guy. And he was in a series of very, very successful movie shorts at Warner's for years and years and years. And they brought him on Jetsons because they thought he's got a pleasant voice. He's got a great comic voice. And he's great at getting angry and getting aggravated. So he's perfect. And it's a much better voice, I think, than Fred Flintstone's. The other thing the Jetsons had going for it wasn't lifted from another show the way the Flintstones was obviously lifted from the Honeymooners. And I think because Joe and Bill weren't paying a lot of attention to the Jetsons, these guys were allowed to get away with stuff that they normally would have been told, no, you can't do that. And why would Joe and Bill do that? I don't know. I'm going to go back a little bit in animation history here. The Fleischer brothers, Max and Dave, were the main competition for Disney in the 30s and early 40s. They were doing the experimental stuff, the three-dimensional backgrounds and multi-plane animation, all these things that Disney would, kind of get to later, but the Fleischer brothers were experimenting with it first. And if you don't know the Fleischer brothers, well, you know their product. They're extraordinarily successful, the series of Betty Boop cartoons. They're the ones that did those awesome 1940s Superman cartoons. And, of course, Popeye. Popeye was a popular comic strip, but the Fleischer brothers brought Popeye to the movie audiences, and the effect was enormous. Incredibly successful, incredibly popular animation studio that only fell down when they moved into feature films, and the feature films failed. And so the Fleischer brothers never really recovered from that. But they worked in these massive animation studios down here in Florida. They weren't in California. They worked down here in Florida. And the thing about the Fleischer studios was they had a story department. They had writers. They had animators. They had all the rest of it. But the other thing they had was they had Dave Fleischer. And here's Dave featured here. And he's showing off one of their famous 3D animation effects. You got to see old Popeye cartoons to see these things. It's astounding, even today, that these guys could do this in animation, working frame by frame, cell by cell. But what Dave would do was he would always be in the animation studio, constantly in the animation studio, walking up and down behind the animators, looking at what they're doing, looking over their shoulder and everything else, and saying, look, do this. That'd be funnier. Make this kid do that. Make this guy in the background do this. Do this, do that. And then he would say, well, what's the line here? And they would say, well, here's the line of dialogue. Well, what if we could add a line? Well, you can't add a line. It's already been animated. The lips aren't moving. Doesn't matter. We're going to add a sotto voce line. And if you've seen Popeye cartoons, you know Popeye's always muttering to himself. That's all Dave Fleischer. He's like, well, what if he said this? What if Bluto said this under his voice? And all the funniest lines in the Popeye cartoons were added post-production by Dave Fleischer. And, not by him, by the voice, Jack Mercer, the voice actor, but but Dave would be the inspiration. What would he say here? Couldn't he say something funny? And, so it was always Dave Fleischer behind the scenes, like, let's make it funnier. Let's make it busier. Let's make this gag work better. Let's do this, move this over here. And that's what really made the cartoons. And it gave them like this manic energy where, the base animation is done, but it's never done because Dave can always go back in there and tune it up a little bit. And I always got the impression that the opposite happened at Hanna-Barbera, that Bill and Joe were wandering up and down the animation stands and wandering through the story department saying, that's too interesting. That's too funny. Children won't get that. Make it dumber. Make it stupider. Oh, you want the story to make sense? What the hell with that? we want to fit in more commercials. And I always got the impression that was it. And that's the only explanation for the vapid bunch of nonsense that they would turn out. It's just sad. Now I'm going to make it really sad. I love the Venture Brothers. And I love the Venture Brothers because I don't know if they love or hate Hanna-Barbera. It really doesn't make any difference to me because it pushes buttons in me. The Venture Brothers series is obviously a takeoff of Hanna-Barbera. They use virtually the same characters as Jonny Quest. Even reference Jonny Quest and Scooby-Doo in a bunch of episodes, even to having the Jonny Quest and Scooby-Doo characters appear in the cartoon, most of them in middle age at this point, and drug addicted and sad. And what I like about it is that they do Hanna-Barbera, but they do Hanna-Barbera 1 better. They use all the same techniques of limited animation and all the rest. And they use basically the same design sense you can see here. I mean, Alex Toth could have easily designed these characters. They use the same design sense and everything else. But it's almost like the creators of the show are saying to Hanna-Barbera, this is what you could have done. This is how it should have been done. Yes, you were limited. You were limited in budget. But that didn't need to hold you back. If you thought creatively, if you worked smarter, not harder, you could create something special. And if you watch Venture Brothers, and some of these episodes I watched numerous times just to admire how they set it up. I mean, the workarounds, because there wasn't a big budget on Adult Swim for these things. The workarounds they would do in order to achieve the effects they wanted. And also attention to story, which is something I don't think Hanna-Barbera ever paid any attention to story. Scooby-Doo mysteries don't work at all. They don't even bother to make them work. It's one formulaic thing after another. The solution to every Scooby-Doo mystery is the same. The guilty party is the first person you meet who's not a member of the regular cast. It's just, I don't know. If I was a writer, I would want to shoot myself in the head or shoot them in the head if I was working there. For example, there's an episode of Venture Brothers, 20 Years to Midnight, and it's ingenious. It's ingeniously plotted. Yes, it's a silly parody, and it's coarse and vulgar and everything else. But the makers of the show realized in order for you to be engaged in the show, it has to have a story. It has to have a plot, no matter how silly and nonsensical and non sequitur and crazy the events in the story get. That's not enough. It's got to have a story. It's got to engage you and make you believe in the characters. And 20 Minutes to Midnight is ingenious. It would work as a straight story almost, because it's really, really goofy. But it's just a wonderful episode. So anyway, that's it. I probably crushed everybody. You probably never watch the show again. I promise I won't destroy any more of your childhood idols. I love all the stuff that most of you love, except Babylon 5. But I don't like Hanna-Barbera. I think I've made that perfectly clear. So go have a gay old time. Hey, if you want to contact me, and I'm sure you do after this episode, email me at brunobookstore@gmail.com. brunobookstore@gmail.com is the most reliable way to reach me. I want to thank you for watching. I want you to thank you for listening. I want to thank you, especially if you watched all the way to the end. And I'll see you down the road.